Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Robin Prater, Executive Director of the Lutyens Trust America. We have people joining us to hear from all over the world, and I want to thank and welcome each one of you. This is the 15th webinar on our series on Sir Edwin Lutyens. Today we'll be focusing on Lutyens architecture in New Delhi, India, and although he designed several buildings for that city, we'll be primarily focusing on Rashtrapati Bhavan, the President's House, formerly known as Viceroy's House. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to let those of you listening from India know that you are in our thoughts and our hearts as you experience this latest COVID crisis. This year has truly been difficult. Our speakers today represent the international interest evoked by the work of Edwin Lutyens. Swapna Liddle is an author and historian with a specialization in the history of Delhi. Her interest in Delhi began with an examination of cultural change under early colonial rule, the subject of a PhD thesis. More recently, she's been taking a longer view of the city, looking at a range of questions, such as the development of an aura of imperial power and city planning in the context of specific polities, such as the Mughal and Colonial and the evolution of spaces in the context of multiple identities. Many of these questions also closely impinge on present-day concerns about heritage, its definition, ownership, and management, issues that Swapna is very interested in. She has been raising awareness about the need to preserve the diverse heritage of Delhi among stakeholders and the general public over the last 2 decades. Swapna is also the author of 3 books on Delhi, and we'll put them up in the chat for you. Our second panelist, Grant Marani, is a partner at Robert A.M. Stern Architects, and for almost 4 decades has led the design of a wide variety of projects, from chapels to courthouses, private residences to entire residential neighborhoods across the United States, Australia, Canada, China, the Czech Republic, France, Japan, Kazakhstan, the Netherlands, Hong Kong, and Singapore. A graduate of the University of Melbourne and Cornell University, he joined Robert A.M. Stearns in 1984 and became a partner in 2000. He co-leads the firm's extensive work in China and is currently project partner for the planning and design of several large-scale residential communities. Grant's work has appeared in numerous publications in the US and abroad, and he's co-author of several books focusing on houses designed by his firm, and we'll also put those up in the chat for you. Before we begin, let me remind you that this will be recorded and put on our YouTube channel, as well as on our website for the Lutyens Trust America and the Lutyens Trust. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll answer them at the end as time allows. And thank you so much. I'll turn this over to Swapna and Grant and share my screen.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you so much. I am extremely grateful to Lutyens Trust America and in particular Robin, Martin, Grant, who preparing for this webinar has been almost as much fun as being on it, because we've had such delightful conversations about Lutyens' work in Delhi, and I really look forward to sharing some of my own work that I've been doing on Lutyens and Delhi. I think you have already had a previous webinar where you've discussed things like the planning aspect of New Delhi and how that came about, and Lutyens' great contributions there. I would, however, like to again go back a little bit to what I think is an important aspect of what Lutyens did in Delhi, because to understand what exactly Lutyens did and how it came about, we need to step back a little and look at the whole political project of the creation of a new capital in Delhi. And for that, you have to, of course, go back to the previous British capital in India, which was in Calcutta. Could we have our first slide, please, Robin? Thank you so much. Yes, so the painting you have here is a lithograph which shows Government House, Calcutta. And Government House, Calcutta, of course, had been around for a while. And till 1911, or rather till 1912, Calcutta was the capital. And in fact, the very impetus to change the capital from Calcutta to Delhi was obviously a political one. And the reason for that was very simply the need that was felt to bring about a sort of a makeover in the image of the British Raj. And that was necessitated because of the growing national movement. Now, conservative responses to that rising national movement had involved somewhat more repressive measures, and these had, as had predictably not worked that well. And with a new liberal regime coming in, and in India that was really personified by Charles Harding, the Viceroy, in 1911, a new way of thinking came into government circles and the highest levels, and that the thinking was that as I said, the Raj would have to be reimagined in a way. And the reimagining had consequences. One of them was greater devolution to the provinces, and that involved greater autonomy to the province of Bengal, of which Calcutta was the prominent city. So in effect, by moving the capital of British India away from Calcutta, you would give the province of Bengal greater autonomy. So that was one very important reason for moving the capital out of Bengal. It was supposed to be a change that would be welcomed by the Indian population. It was meant for them. And obviously, there were a lot of powerful commercial interests in Calcutta, which didn't take that very well. But by and large, this was something that was meant for the benefit of the Indian public opinion. So this was the impetus for the transfer to away from Calcutta. But why Delhi? Could we have the next slide, please? To understand why Delhi, it was very well understood that Delhi had for centuries been the capital of successive Indian empires. The last one of them being the Mughal Empire, which had lasted from the 16th century onward, on to the practically the 19th century, and for the immediate predecessors of the British in India. And this is a quote which is actually worth noting because, as Lord Harding says, I've put the quote up there, it says, "Delhi is still a name to conjure with. It is intimately associated in the minds of the Hindus with sacred legends which go back even beyond the dawn of history. To the Mohammedans, it would be a source of unbounded gratification to see the ancient capital of the Mughals restored to its proud position as the seat of the empire." Now, this is interesting that it was being seen as a move that was going to be in the interests of the people of India, as something that would be acceptable to them. And for that to remake the British Raj in this new makeover, nothing could be better than to bring it back to Delhi. Could we have, and incidentally, this photograph, which is from the 1860s, shows substantially a part of the southern part of the site, which later became New Delhi. You can see how it is strewn with, it was strewn with a lot of ruins. That was what the site was. So it's an interesting, those who are familiar with Delhi, this is from the roof of Humayun's tomb. The next slide, please. So that the idea that Delhi was being restored as the capital of Delhi, of India, was also reflected in the invitation cards that was sent out. This announcement that the capital would be shifted, I don't want to go into the background of this, but there was a large coronation darbar that was held in December 1911 to celebrate the coronation and assumption of the title of Emperor of India by George V. And it was during that darbar that he had announced the shifting of the capital. And a few days after this announcement, the invitations were sent out for the laying of foundation stones for a new city that would arise. And interestingly, the invitation cards actually invited people to the inaugurating the restoration of Delhi as the capital of India by laying foundation stones. So I think I've labored that point enough. I would like to move on to the next part of this. The next slide, please. So this was the impact. This is why Delhi was chosen. Again, I will not go into the plan itself, but this political imperative had an impact on the plan as well. And Lutyens himself summed it up quite beautifully in a speech that he gave in 1933, where he said the new city owes its being to Lord Hardinge. His command that one avenue should lead to Purana Killa. Purana Killa is what you see in this print here, the gate in front. It was a 16th century fortress, and another to the Jama Masjid was Jama Masjid is, I will come to it in a minute, was the father of the equilateral and hexagonal plan. This was a sorry nuisance to all whose thoughts could not merge beyond the right angles of New York. So Lutyens talks about how this plan came about. I mean, you've heard a lot about what the plan is. He again talks about the importance of history, which Hardinge drew on to lay a sort of a basic, have a basic expectation of what the plan would be like. Can I have the next slide, please? So one is Indus, the other is Jama Masjid, which he mentions. And Jama Masjid is a major landmark, the main congregational mosque of the 17th century city of Shahjahanabad, established by Shah Jahan, the Mughal emperor. So by linking these two important landmarks, the first Mughal city of Delhi and the last Mughal city of Delhi, through the two major axes to the new city of New Delhi. So this is very much a part. It's not a coincidence. This is very deliberately done. Could I have the next slide, please? This map shows in black the old city of 17th century city of Shahjahanabad, which was by then, at that point, that was the city of Delhi. Those who are familiar with Delhi might know that there have been various sites at which the capital has been located over centuries. It's not been a single site. And so the new site, which is in red, which was New Delhi, was located roughly south of the older city. And I will show you in a minute how the two axes that Lutyens talks about can be seen in this. Could I have that, if we can have, yes, there you go. So one going up towards Jama Masjid, one going horizontally on this map towards Indrabad. And above that, unconnected to these two lines, is a parallel road. Incidentally, that is the main ceremonial avenue of the old city of Shahjahanabad. And it is interesting to note that Kingsway, which was the main ceremonial avenue of New Delhi, which you see as the horizontal line in the map, the longer horizontal line, is exactly parallel to Shahjahanabad's main ceremonial avenue. I think that is not a coincidence. These were references that were being taken from the ruins and existing cities, not only ruins. Purana Killa was more or less a ruin, but Shahjahanabad, of course, was very much a living city. Can I have the next slide, please? So finally, one comes to what impact does this political imperative have on the architecture? What is expected of the architecture? Now, the Secretary, Under Secretary of State for India, Edwin Montagu, had, at the time when the transfer of capital was being contemplated, had this to say: the forces are not mutually destructive. He's talking about India and Britain and the relationship between them. They are mutually complementary. Each has learned much and has much to learn from the religions, the art, and the philosophy of the other. They must meet not with clash or discord, but in harmony and amity. There is a trite quotation that the East is East and West is West, but as a great Bengali writer, here he refers to Rabindranath Tagore, has laid it down: the East and West must meet at the altar of humanity. So this idea that we are in fact to be taking the best from the East and West, and this is what the new capital has to signify was an idea that was there at the very inception. Next, please. So this is what results. This is Rashtrapati Bhavan, Viceroy's house. I will be referring to it as Viceroy's house just for convenience sake right now. Viceroy's house comes out of this particular aim. And because of the lack of time, though it's Lutyens in Delhi and he did a lot more in Delhi, I'm going to discuss only Rashtrapati Bhavan or Viceroy's house. So how does this come to be? The next slide, please. This is what Lutyens actually began with. And as he began with this, these are some of his very early sketches, really. And I don't need to point this out to architects. You will understand the kind of the kind of design he's using for the dome and everything. And he is, in fact, he has this whole idea of what he wants for Government House. But at that same moment, what is happening is that there is from his clients who are, on the one hand, George V himself had pronounced on this to some extent. At the Darbar inaugurating New Delhi, he had said that the new city should be worthy of this ancient and beautiful city. And of course, he had not really laid down at that point what this new city would look like. But he had, in private conversations with Lutyens, pressed him that it should draw from inspiration from India's traditions. Harding had gone one step further. Harding was the man on the ground in the Viceroy, actually in Delhi. And one of the things he did was he appointed to the architectural board somebody called Swinton Jacob. Swinton Jacob was quite a well-known name in India at the time because he was a practitioner of the Indo-Saracenic movement, which was quite popular at that time. And really, Lutyens, I think quite rightly, did not have a very high opinion of Indo-Saracenic architecture, which sought to take Indian elements from buildings and sort of tack them onto Victorian structures. And Lutyens was not a great fan of this, but Harding felt that Swinton Jacob would be an influence who would make sure that Lutyens and then Baker also followed this idea of bringing an Indian style into the architecture. And Lutyens objected to this. He fought with Swinton Jacob. He resisted Swinton Jacob. He at one point rather irritatedly said, could we have the next slide, please? He said that Jacob keeps thrusting on me structures with chhatjas and chatris. And, I don't know what to do with them. Now, the chhatri, of course, is that little cupola on legs, on 4 pillars that you see at the 4 corners. This is, incidentally, it's in the Red Fort in Delhi, 17th century. Yes, that's it. Thank you very much. The chhatri is there. And the chhajja, which he at this stage objected to, which is the cornice that you can see, the very broad cornice under the, yes. So he objected to this. But Harding said, get down to it and look at what you can do with it. And then we have the next slide, please, which shows how he starts to then work on this. And what the genius of Lutyens really lies in how he takes these rather challenging brief from his clients and works on it. And this is a preliminary sketch of what he's trying to work on the chhatris. He's putting in the chhajja. You can see that little chhatri at the corner. And what he finally comes up with is what I'm going to show you through the remaining slides. Just a few thoughts. And of course, the architectural features will be discussed in greater detail by Grant, but I'm just giving you some idea of what he does. So the chhatris, he does something very clever. On the corners here, the 2 corners at the parapet level, he pushes the chhatris really into the parapet, so to speak, in the corners. The roof line, he just pushes the chhatris down into the corners there, very interestingly. The next slide, please. He does something very interesting with the clustering chhatris around the dome. I'll talk about the dome in a minute. But what he does with the chhatris there is they are at the four corners, but you almost don't see them from the front. So he doesn't like the chhatris breaking up the outline of the dome. So he pushes them so close in that you can almost from some angles, you can't see it. But the dome itself is very interesting. It's got that, the broad high drum. It's got, and again, I would leave Grant to discuss individual details, but I'd like you to look at what is clearly a very important inspiration for this particular dome, which is the next slide, please. A very famous and sacred monument in India. It's the Buddhist Great Stupa at Sanchi, which was built sometime in the between the 3rd and 1st century BCE. And you can see the great railing there, which Lutyens has actually used quite effectively in not only the dome, but in other parts of the design of New Delhi as well. And of course, the shape of the dome, the cap on top of it as well. The next slide, please. He uses other things. Here you can see the chhajja quite clearly. This is, of course, Government House itself. It's towards the north face of it. And you can see the chhajja projecting out. And at the far end, you can see what is the battered wall of the fort. And this batter in the walls is very, very prominent in 14th century architecture in Delhi. Harding, in fact, had sent Lutyens and Baker out on tours in central and north India to look at buildings. And you can see some of the things that have been inspired by those visits, Sanchi being one of them. But there are a lot of buildings in Delhi also that you can immediately, when you see them, you say, wow, this is that. And if we look at the next slide, we can see that. This is a 14th century tomb of Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq, and you can see the inspiration of the fort there. And the material, incidentally, is the same. It's red sandstone at that point in the Viceroy's house as well. The next slide, please. The jalis. These are carved stone screens. And these are a very effective device in the Indian climate where they let in light and air without letting in direct sun. And this is from Rashtrapati Bhavan. And if you look at the next slide, you will see that the design of this jali is actually very, very closely modeled on one of the jalis of the Red Fort, which is in Shahjahanabad and dates from the 1640s. The next slide, please. Elephants. And Lutyens uses elephants in more than one place in Rashtrapati Bhavan. Baker uses them a lot more, in fact. But these are really impressive elephants. These are two almost life-size elephants on flanking a very important road, a very important access to Viceroy's house. And here again, also, I find that this reminds me of the Red Fort. Could we have the next slide, please? This is the Red Fort, the 17th century citadel, and flanking the southern gate are these two elephants, pretty much the same size. And in fact, this photograph is from the Coronation Darbar of 1911, and on the horse there in front is George V riding out through those doors. So the elephants also, there was precedent in the Red Fort. Can we see the next slide, please? Mughal gardens. Of course, Mughal gardens also, the idea that there should be Indian elements, the walkways, the water channels, etc., are there in, are a very long tradition in the Mughal tradition. They are taken from the Persian charbags. Can I have the next slide, please? So terraced gardens with walkways and water channels. You can see this Mughal miniature painting from the Baburnama, the first Mughal emperor sometime early in the 16th century, supervising the laying out of a garden. The next slide, please. Water was introduced even inside the buildings, and this is a part of, it is called the grotto. and it has water as an element and a pool. And here again, he was borrowing, I think, also looking at some of the use of water that had been made in Mughal buildings. The Red Fort, again, the emperor's own palace has a channel of water that runs right through it. And in the middle of the building, it kind of widens into a pool, which is this, a shallow pool. Can we have the next slide, please? He uses water, interestingly, even as in fountains at the top of the roof, but I'm not going to talk about that much because Grant will show you that to you much better, but you can see it on the roof here. Next, please. I have told you about what happens on the outside of the building, the kind of political statement that has to be made. And I think Lutyens is absolutely a genius in how he interprets his brief and how he manages to interpret all these elements and make them his own. And that's to me, that is absolutely fabulous, because I think in contrast, Baker, according to me, does a much less impressive job on that front. He is much closer to the Indo-Saracenic style of tacking on things, but Lutyens does it. Why I've shown, this is the only interior picture that I'm going to show, this is the drawing room. And the reason I'm showing you this is to show that in the interiors, that the political imperative of bringing in Indian style was probably a little bit less. So you don't see it quite so much in the interiors, but interiors will be discussed much more by Grant as we go on. The next slide, please. And I'm going to end with this particular slide because I didn't want to end without saying just 2 words about Lutyens's impact on the architecture of New Delhi beyond the buildings that he designed himself. And this is what happens. This is a palace, which is the palace of one of the princely states. These were states which were under British suzerainty, but were otherwise independent. This was a monarchy. And the building that they build in Delhi is actually this, not shall we say, a typical Jaipur palace, but a palace which is very much inspired again by Lutyens' style. And the architect was C.G. Blomfield, who had experience working with Lutyens and Baker. So the influence, and Baker doesn't have that kind of influence. It is mostly Lutyens' buildings which inspire the other architects working on the New Delhi project to design similar buildings and use them again in their own way. But clearly, you know where they're coming from. So it actually leads to an imperial Delhi style, which lasts a little bit beyond Lutyens as well, though not very much longer, because then the modern movement begins. I think I'm going to wind up here because I do want to see what Grant will be sharing with us, and I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you so much.
Swapna, thank you so much. It's a wonderful introduction, and I hope I can live up to your erudite presentation. I would like to start now. Next image, please, Robin, with a quote from Robert Grant Irving's Indian Summer. I think it's very important based on what Swapna just finished her discussion with. The only architectural language that could represent the ideal of British Empire and be adaptable to various climates, Lutyens asserted, was of course classic. It was better, wiser, saner, and more gentlemanlike, so Edwardian, than the sham sentiment of imitation Indian styles. Like Wren, he considered simple geometrical shapes the best, and the classical arch based on the true circle was fundamental to his conception of architecture in the Indian capital. I'm going to be talking about this as we move through the presentation. It's very important to understand this concept. Next, please. And of course, we have to start off the presentation with an animal elephant, which Lutyens describes as a jolly animal. And I think he had a great love for elephants, and you can sense that in his letter to Emily, Lady Emily on the right, his wife, who of course, well, he had a very good connection. She was the former Viceroy's daughter, so that didn't but help him with his commission. So next, please. And Swapna had just discussed the guard rooms, the gates on the lateral road into the square that leads to the Jaipur column. And here you can see the Chhatri and the elephant. And then next image, please. And so let's go through this, because I'm going to be talking about this as we go through the talk. Number one, the elephant's trunk. And that becomes a theme in some of the exterior motifs that Lutyens used. Number two, one could say that's a pith helmet. There's a Chhatri, or part of a Chhatri. Number three is the bell, which is going to be part of the Delhi order, which I'll touch on briefly later on. And number four, the elephant's foot. And it's really the girth, the weight, the massiveness of the elephant, which really does help inform a lot of Lutyens' interpretation, particularly on the exterior of the Viceroy's house. Next, please. And here we have a photograph of the three buildings that made up the capital. And then next, please. And here you can see the two Secretariat buildings framing the Viceroy's house in the distance. And what's important here is that you start to get a sense of the scale of the Viceroy's house when you're in an aerial location. If you go to the next, please. Because what happened, there was a lot of discussion and a lot of arguments regarding the elevation of the placement of the Viceroy's house relative to the two Baker buildings. And on the left, you can see on the top where the Viceroy's house actually was situated in the end, was built that way compared to the way Lutyens wanted it to be, where you would see a lot more of the face, the facade of the Viceroy's house on the approach. This is very important to give some stature, more stature to the importance of the Viceroy's house. Next, please. And here you see the Viceroy's house in its full regalia here. This incredibly long, low building that's just basically one long colonnade that has these two wings to either end, which frame the entrance. And then, of course, the Durbar Hall dome sitting above. And Lutyens would love to have seen more of this building on the approach, but that was not to be. And so that was what he described as his Bakerloo in New Delhi. And next, please. So here we see the plan. We're standing next to the Jaipur column on the right. And you get a sense of the complexity of the program that was Lutyens' task to design. It's basically an H plan with a central dome-like space in the middle. Next, please. And all of Lutyens' major buildings are based on an axis and cross-axis, which you can see quite clearly here is the case. And these axes and cross-axes focus on the main space of the building. Next, please, which is Durbar Hall. And you can see that in this, that is at the center of the composition, not only in terms of axis and cross-axis, but also the overall composition. And what's very important to note here is the distance from the front portico back to the, I was going to actually draw here, is from here to here, which allows the drum, which is so important for Lutyens' composition, to actually be visible as one approaches the building. If it had been set back further, it would have disappeared. And that would have been a very disappointing scenario. Next, please. And in the memorial volume, there is this series of diagrams which show the footprint. Basically, it's a figure ground of the Viceroy's house relative to Versailles and also Westminster. And what's interesting is that the two buildings, Versailles and Westminster, basically a series of courtyards and the like. In Lutyens' Viceroy's house, he also included these loges, which really break up the facades. They bring shadow deep into the building, which is very important given the climate in Delhi. So it's a very big difference between the two, but it's very important to understand the scale of the Viceroy's house relative to those well-known buildings. Please, next. And of course, the dome itself, it consists of the inner room, which you can see here, it's around 75 feet in height, which is here. And then the outer dome, which is around 145 feet in height. Sorry, my drawing's not so great. I'm drawing with a mouse, so excuse the wobbly lines. But here you get a sense of the scale of the interior, and also you get a sense also the scale of the exterior of the podium relative to the dome above. Next, please. Here in plan, you see the Viceroy's house relative in scale to St. Paul's, London. One of Lutyens' favorite architects is Wren, of course. And just to give you some sense of scale, here we have St. Peter's to the right. So the central space, Durbar Hall, is smaller than the central space of St. Paul's, but it has a similar relationship in terms of its proportions to what Wren achieved at St. Paul's in particular. Next, please. And Swapna, of course, had a much nicer image of the stupa at Sanchi, but this will have to suffice for my talk. But what Swapna was referring to, of course, was the wonderful band that you see here, which Lutyens incorporated in his lantern dome above his drum that you can see there. Next, please. And now I'm going to take us back down to the procession, the ground plane, and take you through the floor plan. We have the grand entrance steps with the fountains to either side. Up the steps, we come into the main entrance portico, which you can see on the right. And what's fascinating here for me is that, next please, is Lutyens' reference to the Pantheon, where he's talking, well, just utilizing the pronaos, which you can see to either side of the main entrance to the Pantheon. He has incorporated that same idea, as you can see here, in his entrance portico. So he's quite willing to borrow, which is nothing wrong with that, elements where they're appropriate and to help make the space feel more ceremonial and help with the overall scale of the building. Next, please. Now we're inside the Durbar Hall. I think that you can get a sense that of the scale of the space here, the very interesting floor pattern that you see in the left, the exedra, which are in the four corners of this main space, and now how that is developed spatially in the right, where you see they flank the main platform within Durbar Hall. Next, please. And for reference, we have the Pantheon, and here you can see that Lutyens actually picked up on the way these columns are incorporated into the wall. It's distyle in antis, basically, and Lutyens used that same idea in the exedra, as you can see here in Durbar Hall. Next, please. And this is one of the most beautiful rooms, I think, in the Viceroy's house. It's the State Library, and you can see, of course, what's also wonderful is just the way these beautiful drawings that show at different quarters the various levels of the room. So you really get a sense of how Lutyens is thinking when he was going through the design process. Next, please. And of course, the paradigm or the precedent here is St. Stephen Walbrook by Wren. Lutyens speaks highly of this building. It's one of his favorite Wren interiors, and you can understand why it became a paradigm or a precedent for Lutyens' library. Next, please, which you can see here again. Next, please. And one of the things that makes the Viceroy's house very unique is the stairs, the way the stairs are incorporated into the design. There are 4 interior stairs. There are stairs that flank Saddlebag, basically the north and south of Durbar Hall, and you can see the south one to the in the middle of the screen now. And you get a sense of the space that people, as they arrive, they come up from below, up these set of stairs, and proceed to Durbar Hall. And some of the elements that appear in Durbar Hall actually appear here as well. So Lutyens prepares people for the architecture that they will be seeing once they get into the main space of the Viceroy's house. Next, please. And adjacent to or overlooking that stair hall is the South Stair Hall, which hallway, which is really a spill-out space for when there are large functions going on in the state dining room and the ballroom, which is beyond at the end of this hall. Next, please. And I think this is, for me, was one of the truly masterful works of Lutyens. The stair, the Viceroy's stair, which leads to the Viceroy's wing. And here, the stair, for me, has the compression, the delight, the power of Michelangelo's Laurentian Library stair. It's just, this is so compact and so incredibly strong in its character. And it really makes you want to be there and participate in the experience of the space. And next, please. And then at the end, I should say behind the Durbar Hall, is this magical space which leads down the stairs to a loggia which leads out to the Mughal Gardens, and we'll get to there in a moment. But as you, I trust you all know that this is not a blue ceiling, but that is in fact open to the sky. And this is probably one of the most magical outdoor rooms that you could, that are in architecture, period. Next, please. And to either side of the main body of the building, where Durbar Hall is located, are 2 courtyards where water is introduced within or adjacent to the building. Swapna had mentioned the fountains on the top of, on top of the building, but also there are water features introduced in these 2 courtyards to help make people feel cool. And there are references to Lutyens' other work with these particular elements. Next, please. And of course, the Mughal Gardens, what a treat. What you see here is one of the channels which lead back to the Viceroy's house, and this spectacular fountain, beautiful gardens and the like, and all these waterways, water elements are really very much a product of what Lutyens learned during the design of many of his great houses in England. Next, please. And the relationship of these waterways really has to do with the visual connection between the 2 principal rooms that face out towards the west, and that's the state dining room and the state ballroom. They are on axis with these great water elements, as you can see, and then that then opens up to the gardens themselves. Next, please. And I mentioned at the very start about Lutyens' obsession with the elephants, those jolly beasts. And here you can see the elephant pergola that frames the view back from the tennis court area, which is to the very west of the garden here. You can see the top of the page, and it frames the view back towards the drum of the Viceroy's house. Next, please. And then here we have the screen that overlooks the tennis courts. And when I was discussing this with Martin the other day, he made the observation, which I think is very correct, that these two openings here recall Lutyens' round glasses. And I don't know why anyone would wear round glasses myself, but anyway. But that's it's another witty pun that Lutyens plays. And then of course on the left is those what can only be described as Lutyensian stairs, which just absolutely cascade. They're like water. They just cascade down from one level to the next. Next, please. And talking about cascading, I'm also using the same image that Swapna had used, where there is a set of stairs which take you down from the Mughal gardens down to this grotto, which is really a spectacular space. In our office, we had actually borrowed this idea on a project we designed in Tokyo some 25 years ago now, but that's another story. And next, please. And Lutyens' Delhi order. This is a book in itself, I think, another whole talk. Lutyens is very proud of the fact that he was able to synthesize an inspiration from India, from the Janai temple in Mudbiri, I believe it is, and we incorporated those bells into the capital you can see here, which appears not only in the Jaipur Hall, Darbar Hall, but also on a number of fireplaces surrounds within the Viceroy's house. Really beautiful detailing here. And then Lutyens likes to design everything, of course. And here you see an almirah or a armoire that's on the way from the guest rooms to the state dining room. And of course, he plays with scale. And next, please. So here you get a sense of the scale here. So again, it's this I think is very witty on the part of Lutyens, and so you can see here how he incorporates elements that he had on the exterior, on the interior with the small replicas of the fountains from the exterior. And his fascination with geometry, I mentioned that at the very start, it is everywhere within the Viceroy's house, from the paving patterns in all of the major rooms, his attention to the geometry on the exterior of the building pervades everything. And here you can see how he used geometry in the design of one of many chairs he designed for one of the bedrooms, in fact, bedroom number 14 in the Viceroy's house. And next, and I'm going to close with a few images here. I mean, one of the things that I think everyone loves about Lutyens, at least I do, is he goes from being incredibly serious to almost being silly. And he has a wonderful sense of humor. And I think that when has the opportunity to do something that can be less than serious, he does so when he works on designs for the children's nursery here at the Viceroy's house. And I think that this is really a wonderful sense of humor that he has that really balances the incredible talent, intellect, and masterful play of his architecture both on the exterior and the interior. And I just think, actually, as I say that, I'm just remembering something Swapna said. What's fascinating about this building is the fact that Lutyens on the exterior was able to incorporate, when appropriate, ideas that are from India, that are based in India. But once you go on inside the building, then he becomes really a strict classicist, and the Indian influence is less so what it is on the exterior. And that's what I find very fascinating about Lutyens' work on this particular building. Next, please. I just want to give you the sources here, and I also want to thank 3 people in our office, Leo Velarde, Kristen Gates, and Tom Nye, who helped with this presentation. And I should mention that Tom and Kristen actually traveled to India on a fellowship, a Ramsar fellowship that we give out to once every year to people in the office who prepare a thesis for their travel, and they had selected a comparison between Lutyens and Corbusier. So thank you, and Robin.
I want to thank both of you for all the excellent presentation and for all the work that I know went into that presentation. I found it very enjoyable. If any of you watching have not already joined the Lutyens Trust America or the Lutyens Trust and you're enjoying these webinars, we'd ask you to please consider joining us. We'd love to have you as a member. And thank you for listening. And now we'll take some questions from those of you that are listening. Marcos, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, so we have a question here from Digvijoy Sodhi for Swapna. And the question is, Lutyens lacked the experience of designing such grand projects, which his colleague Baker had under his sleeve from South Africa. Lutyens was married to the daughter of former Viceroy of India, Earl of Lytton. Do you think this played as a major influence on his appointment as the chief planner of New Delhi?
Yes, I mean, to some extent, yes, of course, you had to be well connected to be in consideration. I mean, he was, though ultimately his coming on to the town planning committee was probably had something to do with that. But as far as his design for Government House is concerned, he worked on the design while he was officiating on the town planning committee, and he managed to convince Harding that he would be the right choice for an architect for the Government House, because at that stage they were talking about competitions and things like that. So as far as the architecture goes, he impressed Harding by the plans that he was making. So that is really the reason that he was chosen.
There's also a kind of second part to the question, which was also asked by Anki Barnes, which is a wonderful pair of presentations as a comment. And despite Lutyens' clear reservations about incorporating Indian motifs and influence in the building, yet did so with success, did he ever admit later on that the work was better and more interesting and relevant because of this integration?
I don't know whether Grant or Martin would be aware of this. I don't know, but I'm sure he was proud of the work he'd done, and quite, I think, rightly so. It's an excellent, he's done it's a work of genius. I mean, there's no two ways about it. So I'm sure he would have been proud of it, but I can't answer that with specifics.
Well, one way you can tell that he was proud, when he really liked something, he used it again. So in his last work that he did with his son, there's quotations from Rashtrapati Bhavan. He used the Delhi Bell order, and he used several things. He also, you'll recognize things in Castle Drogo. So I think he was very pleased with the work.
And Swapna, I think you hit the nail on the head, so to speak, when you said the word genius. I think that if you are a genius, then whatever you do is correct. So, case closed. You're married to a lawyer, so.
So there was a question from Sai Pawar, but I think it was largely answered about the Sanchi Stupa and St. Peter's Basilica and the Roman Pantheon. So I think we'll move on to a question from Pushkar. What exactly was the need to reimagine the Raj in 1911?
Very, very shortly, it was basically, as I said, the rising national movement and the fact that conservative ways of dealing with it through things like, if you're familiar with Indian history, the partition of Bengal, etc. These were things that were not working. The idea was that you have to have a softer solution to this. And this meant greater devolution to Indians, greater participation of Indians in things like legislative councils, etc. And this was part of that whole reform movement that was coming in through the Government of India Act of 1919, etc. Before that, 1909. So it was part of that, that reform movement that was coming in. So it's just that. It ties in with other movements in Indian history. I think that's my my thesis, is that you should look at, obviously look at changes in architecture and town planning in decisions like this are related to the politics of the times.
There's a couple of questions about the new Parliament building coming up, and how will that impact the legacy of the Viceroy House and Lutyens' legacy?
A new Parliament House, of course, is designed by Baker. It's not one of his best. And this I'm talking entirely as my personal opinion. And again, my opinion is based not on architectural merit, but on traditions. Parliament House is something that India's parliamentary history is tied up with. This is where our constitution, in this building, our constitution was debated, it was passed. This was the, where independent, Parliament House has had Indian sitting in it from the very day it was inaugurated. This was part of the reform movement that happens, devolution of power, giving Indians greater participation in the government. This is what it's about. So for me, at a personal level, it's a bit sad that we will abandon that building and move on to a new parliament, because there are these traditions which are connected to that building.
Thank you, Swapna. Is there any documentational evidence that shows the current parliament's design is influenced by Chausath Yogini temple, or is that an urban legend?
I think there is no documentary evidence. People look at the two buildings, they look at the proportions, etc., and make that speculation. But really, I mean, I myself have speculated on that, but in the absence of any definite, as far as I know, no documentary evidence at all.
And I think a last question for today is, where were the materials for the building sourced? Were they locally sourced?
Yes, so Swapna, you would know the details, but both stones were typical of Lutyens. He always liked to use local materials and in all of his work. And these stones were sourced, I think, is roughly within 100, 150 miles of the new Viceroy's house. So, but I'm sure Swapna knows the exact location.
So these are coming from actually the same mines from which the Mughal buildings were, stone for the Mughal buildings were mined, in Dholpur, in Fatehpur Sikri, that area, Makrana, a lot of this in Rajasthan as well. So these are, it's the same marble, in fact, the Makrana marble, which you see in Government House. And one of the things that I love to point out when I go to, when I take walks in Rashtrapati Bhavan, is that Lutyens and his team was so particular about how the stone was picked, how it was cut, the grain of the stone. And you can see that if you look carefully, you can see how particular they were about the use of the stone as well, and responding to the grain of the stone, for instance, and the quality of the stone. It has stood up so well because only the best pieces of red sandstone were used. Sandstone is a material which tends to be, and if you've got a bad piece, that you'll regret it for the rest of the life of that building. But they were so particular about, and the Central Public Works Department, which was executing this, was very fed up with their constant demands that only the best pieces would be used. So, but it has, this was thinking for the future. This is not, no cutting corners as far as material is concerned.
And using the material of the area is very typical of Lutyens. That's something he believed in from the beginning of his practice.
Yes.
There's two or three more questions, but alas, I think we've pretty much run out of time. So I think we should wrap it up.
So thank you very much. We appreciate your talk and your time.
Well, thank you, Robin. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Lovely talk.
Thank you so much, Marcus, Robin, Martin, and of course Grant for a lovely presentation and for having me. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you all. Thank you all.